Hello, Shirley Adams here. On the last program, first of the series, we listened to fabric, and then we made it into the appropriate garments dictated by its weight and its behavior. On this second program, we're going to do a few contrary things. If we change the character of that fabric so that it no longer behaves the same way, we open up a whole new realm of possibilities for fabric usage. Quilting is the change we're going to try today. Using the jacket I'm wearing as an example, this fabric began as a blouse fabric. It's rayon challis, and it's fairly lightweight. And after a trip through the washer and the dryer, it proved to be also a fabric that wrinkles easily, and that made it undesirable for packing and traveling because it's going to get crushed and it's going to need to be pressed every time. Well, quilting will eliminate that wrinkling since the filling layer keeps it puffed out, and now it can be washed, dried, and it's ready to wear without ever an iron. Well, we've all done a lot of blazers, a lot of tailored clothing, and so I'm not going to do anything tailored in this quilted program. I'm instead going to use some very soft styling, something a little lighthearted in these quilted jackets. Now, use a very simple pattern because complicated details and seaming would just get lost in all this design that's here, all this quilting that's done. So you don't want a whole lot of seams. You don't want pockets and such details that would distract from that. Instead, you want just your design to show up. That's the star of this garment. So whether it is a print fabric or whether it's a solid, either one. The fiber content can be anything of your choice. It can be knit or woven. You can mix them up. Just make sure that they're compatible because all layers of this jacket are going to stay together permanently, and so they have to be either washed or dry cleaned or done in whatever way the same thing has to be done to all of them. I'm going to show you another one in a little bit that is the fashion fabric layer is going to be of one fiber construction, one fabrication. It's going to be woven, and the reverse side, the lining side, is going to be a knit. So you can mix these things. Just make sure they're all compatible. Then the filling layer, that's the inside. That's what makes it puff up, or batting layer. Now this can be the fluffy type made for quilts, or it can be cotton or poly types made especially for quilted clothing. Or fleece is another possibility, but it's considerably more firm than the others. So it might not be a bad idea to try a little sample of each to decide about what your personal preference is. So of the things that I have here, here is just quilt batting. Now this quilt batting is kind of heavy, it's kind of thick if I would use it as is. So what I've done in the jackets where I used this was peel it apart. It just very nicely comes apart in thinner layers, and that way it's not a problem of any sort. So if it's thick, you would do that, but I'll get back as I talk about some of these things, about some of the other possibilities and how you test them. Then the bottom layer of all this, the lining layer. That layer also can be anything of your choice, whether it's knit or woven or whatever, but if you use something silky, slippery, as I've done here, then it slides on and off very easily, making it very comfortable, making it easy to wear, and an additional lining layer is unnecessary as long as this slides so well. So let's see how all this begins. This little sample that I have here is just to show myself what I want to put together in these layers. What I've done on this side is put some of that quilt batting, that fiber fill, that is just very soft, and I have split it so that it's a thinner layer. And this is very soft when it's quilted to the back of it, to the lining. Everything's very soft here. Here I've actually used fleece, and you can see by the way I hold it, and it doesn't just droop down completely, it stands out a little bit. You can see this is stiffer. This would be very applicable to making belts. It would do very well for that. But my personal preference for clothing is to use a batting. Now also, there are several new things just recently on the market that you might want to try. Here's another of that quilt batting that you can peel layers apart. But some of the new things on the market are thin fleeces. They're thin enough, whether this one's polyester and this one's cotton, they're thin enough that they won't make it too terribly firm if you do put this as your filling layer between the lining and the fashion fabric layers. It won't make it too terribly heavy, but it will make it a little bit more firm than that original one that I showed you, than the quilt batting. Now here's one that really was not intended for clothing, and you'll find this also, so don't mistake this when you're doing the others. This is a fleece meant for other craft projects. It's great for belts, but it's not meant for clothing because you can see by putting my hand under it how it is just quite firm, quite stiff, and so it isn't the best thing to use probably for an article of clothing that you're going to wear. Well, where all this started was from an article I wrote for Sew News a little while back. This was the cover of it. I no longer have that jacket because I have a daughter who's the very same size as I am, and she fell in love with this jacket and its colors and all its quilting, and she conned me out of it. Now, if you have a daughter, you know what I'm talking about. She comes home and raids my closets. But anyway, I don't have that, but I do have some scraps of the same fabric, and I'm going to show you how I stitched that. So this is where the idea came from, and I got so much reader response on this saying, we'd like to see more of this. That's why I decided, well, let's do a program on that and do a little bit more of it. So here's where I would start if I were you in making these choices. As far as what filling, because that's the biggest choice I think, what filling layer you really want to use with this. So here I've made a little chart for myself, and I can refer to it from time to time. If I'm going to make a bunch of jackets, but a few months in between each one, I can go back to this, refer to it to see what my preferences are. So what I have up here is the various types of fleeces, and I've put them in between, and they're sticking out here so that I can see what they are, and I even have them printed, the labels printed here, so that I can refer to them and use the same brand if I want to. So after I've put those between a couple layers of fabric and I've stitched around just any old way to quilt it so that it simulates the jacket it's going to finally become, and down here is the quilt batting, the very soft one, then I can feel all these and decide on each individual project, okay, what do I want for this? And it will vary, remember, depending on what fabrics that you use for the top, for the underlayer. So you might use different things at different times, whatever suits you best. Well, the easy way to get going on this, one of the things I love about sewing is that there are at least 20 ways, at least, to do everything that you might consider doing, and all of them can be very successful. You just find the way that works best for you and with your equipment and go on from there. Well, the way I do this is to first stack the layers I'm going to use. So what I have stacked here is a lining layer on the bottom, and then I have on top of that my filling layer, my fiber fill, my batting layer, and then on top of that I have my fashion fabric layer. And I'm going to put those layers down and cut them out all at one time if I want to with the pattern, or I can cut this individually, one layer at a time, and put them together later. Now it probably depends on how big a piece of fabric we're talking about, because if it's yards and yards, it doesn't make sense to stack them first and then cut out. It would make a whole lot more sense to cut out the individual pieces, then stack them as you're ready to do some stitching. Now, when we stitch this, it's going to possibly condense a little bit. It may not be quite as large, and for that reason, every time I cut mine out, whether they're jackets, vests, whatever I might be making, I always cut it a little bit carelessly, frankly, and you can cut this either with scissors or you can use a rotary cutter, either way, to cut through the layers, whatever your preference is. But as I cut this out, I'm a little careless, and I always cut it slightly larger, maybe about a ½ inch larger all the way around than the actual pattern is. That way, if it condenses while I'm sewing on it, while I'm doing the quilting, it doesn't matter. I still have that little insurance policy all the way around. And then when I'm finished with the quilting, then I can put my pattern piece on again and recut it, trim off the little bit of excess around the outside. So this is how we get going. Then we decide, before we sit down at that machine and do anything, exactly what kind of designs we're going to do. And here's how I decide what I'm going to do. If it is a very prominent pattern, as this first one was that I had here, this pink jacket, it was really quite prominent. It had very definite little flowers here, abstract sort of, but flowers. And so I quilted around all those. Then there were areas here where it had nothing that could be used for tracing. So that's where I just joined it all with straight stripes. So this is a combination of striping and tracing around the design, and that made it very easy. Now all of these are very easy. Nobody has to be an artist to do any of this. No matter how unartistic you might be, you can still do this successfully. Just let the fabric speak to you and give you some good ideas on what type of quilting to do. So here's one type. This, by the way, is kind of pretty on the inside. I didn't mean to wear this wrong side out. I suppose I could. I've bound all the seams and finished it carefully, removed the shoulder pads, and I could perhaps wear it inside out. So think about this. If you want to do two for the price of one, go ahead and make it reversible. But this vest definitely is reversible. And on this one, it also looks, if I would reverse this, it looks on the inside as though, oh my, an artist took a lot of time drawing the lines, doing this design, making this pattern, when actually you and I know that nothing artistic was involved in it at all. All this little tracing around here is simply tracing the print fabric that was on the other side. I just used the prominent design and traced around there, which is very easy to do, and we can all do it successfully. So this is another way to do it. Just trace around the design, and if it's a prominent design, then you can use that design completely and not worry about doing any other lines. Here's a really easy way, and what I did on this one is just stitch straight across. Well, maybe you can see it a little bit better on the inside since this is a dark print. Now this print originally I had bought for a blouse. It's a thin wool, but it's kind of an expensive wool to the point where I thought, oh, it's a waste to make another blouse. I have so many, many blouses. It's important enough that it needs to be a jacket. So that's why I quilted it and made it into a jacket to make a more important garment. But what was so easy about this one is the fact that I first of all did a line that was perpendicular to the center front line. Use an L square for that, or use a piece of paper which always has a square edge. That's a 90-degree angle there. Just put that down along the center front and stitch one line across on your machine so that it is perpendicular to the center front line. Thereafter, you simply use your presser foot as a guide and just do parallel rows all the way along that. Just stitch all these parallel rows. So this you can just do lickety-split. Actually, this dark print jacket that I have here and that original pink jacket I made in about 2 days' time, and that was including cooking dinner and running errands and doing anything else. This one took about a day and a third, and this one took about 2/3 of a day to make. So they aren't all that time consuming. But on this one, the fact that every time you go around, you have to do some starting and stopping. You have to decide whether to tie knots, whether to stitch in place, whether to backstitch, but all that takes a little time, and you try it all ways to see how it works out best for you. On this one, what made it so very quick is that it was just parallel lines, just stitched very simply, and I didn't have to start and stop anywhere. I just started at one edge of the fabric and stitched way off to the other edge. So that's why it made this extremely easy to do. And then I have another jacket here, which is just contemporary. When I saw this fabric, it rang a bell as I saw this in the store. For what reason, I didn't know. It's not ordinarily the colors that I wear, but somehow it attracted me, and it said, hey, I want you to buy me. So it suddenly hit me why. It's because I knew at home I had this bag of wonderful yarns, little odds and ends of yarns that a friend had given me. And it just hit me all of a sudden, even though I hadn't looked at these yarns for months, that those are the same colors that are in this fabric. This is an upholstery fabric, actually. So that's why I bought this, and decided that this sort of semi-striped design on this just looks sort of windswept. It looks like the wind is blowing this way and that way. So that's exactly how I stitched on the inside, but I'll show you a little bit of that in a while. I'll demonstrate some of that. But you can see it just sort of blows back and forth, and while the wind was blowing on it, I put a little bit of that yarn here and there and just stitched right across it. So I do have yarn throughout this, the yarns that I got from my friend. Something else that was fun on this jacket, by the way, was the fact that there were no buttons that would even remotely come close to being agreeable with this fabric and the mood of it. So finally, in desperation, as I was looking at buttons on the card, I turned one over and looked at the back side, and I thought, bingo, that's it. It exactly works, even though the right side, the side that was intended as the button, doesn't do anything for it. So think about that. Use things the wrong way sometimes if they are more suitable for whatever it is you're doing. So okay, these are the jackets that I have with me today, and I'm going to show you the different types of quilting I've done. After I have all those layers all stacked together and a few pins in it, and you may not want to put any pins in it at all. When you're doing yours, you may want to instead do some basting, or maybe just hold it together. If it's large enough, you may want to put it in a hoop and stitch that way. There are some other variables that we're going to have to be concerned about. For one thing, what kind of foot are you going to use? Now, what I have chosen to use for right now that I'm going to be demonstrating on is a darning foot. It works very nicely. It kind of walks with the fabric, and so I kind of like that for doing this quilting, so that works well. Some of the other feet that you have that you might want to try would be the roller foot. That might be the best thing on your machine and with the fabric you have, depending on its thickness and its firmness. The walking presser foot would do quite well. This also can be done very successfully with just the standard presser foot that you would have on your machine for most sewing. So try it always possible on a little scrap before you ever start. And make that scrap big enough that you might be able to turn it into some sort of a project later on. So I have all those put together. I might as well just use this little jacket, I guess. And the jacket, I'll do this the way I did that jacket that my daughter has on permanent loan is what it is. She's going to have it forever and never give it back to me, I know. But with this darning foot, I can just move this around any way I want to. I don't have to have, because this is firm enough, I therefore don't have to have, and I have it down, the pressure down too far, so I'll lighten up on that somewhat. I am not going to have a hoop or anything under this to firm it up. This is firm enough as is. And I'm just going to move it around like this and go at whatever rate of speed is the best for you and make different shapes. So I'm just doing this to try it out. Okay, the shape I actually did on that jacket out of this fabric was a big leaf design, kind of like elm leaves. Don't do a complicated leaf, for goodness sake, or you will be forever doing this. So I just sort of did big shape like this, an elm leaf, since it's simple, since it's easy. And then just using the presser foot, just go round and round with that. And it can go backwards, sideways, any which way. But become adept at this and be able to use it very easily, very proficiently before you go ahead and do your regular project. But try this on a sample. So this is one way, and I just go around and keep making that leaf bigger and bigger and come in with some other leaves from other directions and just keep covering it completely until finally there were no bare spaces left. It was all covered with leaves, made bigger, smaller, etc. You might also, besides doing that, just do something completely different, a different shape. Let's see what else I have here. Maybe this one I would follow the lines completely. I'll show you on this one how I just did the straight stitch and why that's so easy. And that's because with the straight stitch, you simply start stitching here and go right along those lines from one end to the other. Because on this particular fabric, as I'm holding it here, I can see that it's creeping a little bit. The top layer is creeping slightly. So if that's the case, then it might be better, as long as you're making straight lines especially, to not use the darning foot. That's when you'd switch to a straight stitch foot and do it more simply that way. Here I've just made a little corkscrew, same fabric, but just go round and round with that foot and you'll find that it's just not a problem. Here's the pink jacket, so let me do a little stitching here. Now, where I had to make some decisions was, how do I start and stop it? Maybe with the foot down, so you just stitch in place first, and then you start going around, in which case use a little something to stop fraying so that it won't ravel out when you're finished at the beginning and the end, or else your other choice would be to actually backstitch a little here or there. So okay, here I am following the fruit, flowers, whatever we have there, and then just doing stripes in between. So this was another technique. And then really a fun one was doing that windswept design. And I see I need to pull my thread out a little bit more. There we go. Okay, this windswept design that I had fun with, the upholstery fabric, I kind of like to use fabrics that aren't intended for the particular purpose that you're using them in this case, but upholstery fabrics make wonderful jackets, and so it's kind of a good idea to use it for jackets or vests. And with this one, I also was just stitching back and forth as the mood moved me. This is sort of mindless stitching, all this is. It's kind of idiot's delight. You don't think about it. You just while your cares away as you do all this stitching. So with this one, I did just throw little pieces of yarn on here and there as I was doing the stitching. And I'll just take a small piece here. And as I was stitching this particular piece here, since it does have the same color in it, as I was stitching back and forth, I'd put some yarn there and simply stitch over it and do whatever I wanted with that. And you can see how easily that would work out also. Anytime I'm doing any of these things, I feel it easier to do big things first, big designs. For instance, on that plaid one that I started out with, I would come in from all the edges and do a big leaf here and a big leaf there and do different leaves of that sort so that it would hold the jacket together pretty well, and then I could take all the pins out and not be bothered with them thereafter. Well, I did the same thing with this windswept one. I first of all did one line across this way and then one big line across this way and then maybe one down here, and then I filled in all those spaces later. And this is the easiest way to do it, so that you first temporarily hold it together before you then start stitching and filling in all the spaces. Now, the more you stitch on this, the more lines you have going back and forth in every which way, the firmer this fabric will be. So if you don't want it terrifically firm, if you want it to stay kind of soft, it's a good idea to do less of these rows, except I warn you, you do get carried away, and you just keep stitching away because it's such fun and you hate to let go of it. Well, after you have all of these pieces done, individual pieces, you then go ahead and put your pattern back on it so that you can cut it down to size, because it possibly has condensed somewhat. So cut it down to size, and then you're ready to just put it together as you ordinarily would that jacket. You're also going to have to decide, after you put it together then, exactly what you're going to do about finishes every place. Well, what I did with this, as far as seams go, I eliminated them. I told you about eliminating a seam on the last show. Well, I've done the same thing here on the side seam. They were completely straight lines there, so I just overlapped front and back, put the seams together at the pattern stage before I cut it out, and now I don't have to worry about that seam. That means I don't have to, on the print fabric, worrying about the matching, which gives you a little head start on it. So that's kind of a good way to do it whenever you can. Anytime I'm dealing with big pieces, I don't want to do it that way because it's too much to put under the presser foot, to put under the arm of the machine here. It's just too cumbersome. So if they're large pieces, I'm going to keep them individual and not combine them. The only seams then that were actually in this were right here on the shoulder. I just had to put the shoulder seams together, and with that shoulder seam up here, I took it to the outside first, and on the outside, I put another piece of fabric on top. Right here, it's hard to see because it blends in quite well. I just put another piece of fabric on top here with the seams turned under on either side and top stitched that in place, and that hides the seam. What I've done to the edges of these jackets, several of these, around to the neck edge and up and down the front edge here, I've bound that with some bias. And I'm not going to demonstrate this on this program because I'm going to do it on a later program, do some bias binding on things. What this actually is a blouse pattern. If you can picture this, just an ordinary blouse that you'd have a collar, sleeves. I simply turned over the front here. This is kind of like a little blouse pattern. I simply turned the front lapel back here down to the waist, and I cut it that way. I used the arm's eyes as they were from the blouse pattern, no changes there, and I cut it off at the waist then. And down here at the waist, I put a casing so that I could put this drawstring through it, and it ties, it adjusts that way. So that's one way to finish it. Some of these have just hems, so this is not meant to be worn inside out at all. It's not reversible. But I've simply turned up a hem. I cut it extra long to begin with and turned up a hem. I think I've done the same thing on the dark printed jacket here. I've just turned up a hem, and so that also over here worked out quite nicely. Again, it's not meant to be reversible. So if you're going to reverse, you better bind it. You better do something else that will work out more to your liking. Well, try these things out, as I said, first on a scrap, but don't try it out on just a scrap that you're going to throw away. Do it on a scrap that's big enough to make some sort of a project, like this little purse, which could be a little formal purse or it could be a little makeup bag, but do something of this sort. What you need to make this is just an ordinary sized piece of paper, a piece of typing paper, which would look about like, if I can pull one out here, which would look about like this. Okay, 8.5 by 11 is probably how I started out on this purse. This makes a nice size sample because when that's folded in half later on, that would make a little purse so that you wouldn't have wasted all your time. So this one also I did with metallic thread, notice. And with this little stitching of metallic thread here and there, it slightly glitters, and so it gives it a little bit of a festive look since it does have that metallic in it. Here I've done a sample that would also make a purse if I wanted to, a makeup bag perhaps, and I've done it so that it's two different colors, a different plaid on each side. Then I still have time to decide, okay, which is really going to be the outside of my purse. Is it going to be the blue or is it going to be the pink side? You might do something with metallic threads and put some beads on it also, as I have here. After I got through stitching it with metallic thread on the machine, then I hand stitched a few of those beads here and there. This would make a terrific formal purse. So this is something you might want to try. What I loved on this sample is the fact that I used something really kind of crummy for the back side. It was just some lining fabric that was not pretty at all. But by the time it's quilted, and the quilting I did here, of course, is following the design in the fabric. The print design that's there is how I quilted this. But by following that design, it makes a really pretty design on the back side, and it's something that you might be very pleased with. So the print makes you look like an artist when it shows up on the solid. Now, any fabric you like from the bolt, you're going to like even better when you quilt it, and its value also greatly increases. Well, these garments fall in the wearable art category, which means that they don't easily succumb to fashion's ever-changing whim. You'll be able to enjoy your work of art for several years. And speaking of works of art, and this one in particular, this vest, they're everywhere this year. We've all been wearing vests. We love them. They just complete things very nicely. They run the whole gamut of possibilities in fabrics. There are all kinds of shapes, long and short and fitted and blousy. So next time, let's consider the vest and how it can help complete the wardrobe. Come join us then.